In this lecture, we're going to take a look at Chapter 16 and slavery. And you see the outline that we're working off of today, so take a moment to take note of what this outline is so that you're ready as we progress through. Slavery is one of those things that is nicknamed the peculiar institution. It was something that a lot of Americans realized was not really congruous with the ideals of the American Revolution. It didn't really seem to fit with the United States, but it was there. And so people came up with euphemisms to describe it, and one of them was the peculiar institution. You remember that slavery had been dying in the United States at the time of the Constitutional Convention, and people at that meeting believed that truly within a generation or so, slavery would die out naturally. The South at the time was burdened with depressed prices. They had unmarketable goods. The land was overcropped. And so they really had reason to believe that things were going to just sort of die out when it came to slavery. But as you know, in 1793, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, and that changes everything. What had been really this dying business, now all of a sudden there is this increased demand for slaves. And there was such a demand for slaves and for the cotton that they are going to be used to cultivate, that cotton becomes this dominant crop in the South. And it's not just dominant, it is so dominant that people refer to it as king cotton. Pretty soon, half of the world's cotton comes from the American South. And the South is going to surpass India as the world's leading producer of cotton. And it wasn't just that this is something that is important to the American economy, it's so important to the British economy as well. Because there are so many British mills that operate using American cotton, the belief is from the South that if the North tries to interfere with slavery, then if a war were to come, England is going to support the South in a war against the North. And it's similar to the reason as to why in the War of 1812, Britain decided to stop attacking American ships. It wasn't necessarily because they felt that it was wrong and they saw the light. It was that a lot of the British merchants, the people in England, felt that their personal economies were being hampered by this. And so the people of Britain put pressure on Parliament to stop that practice because it was hurting them. The South believes that the same cycle would repeat. If there were a situation between the North and the South and a war were to break out, the South is going to have the support of England because the English people are going to demand that they continue to get Southern cotton so that they can continue working and the factories in England will continue to operate. So let's start taking a look at the system of slavery itself and who really is running the system. There is a Southern aristocracy, and this group has a vital economic interest in keeping the plantation system. This Southern aristocracy has the political power to keep the system. They're the ones who own the slaves, and they really are the ones who are running the state governments in the South and are being elected to the federal government to represent the South. The rule of the rich kind of sets the tone throughout the American South, and they really do live a pretty good life. They have leisure time, they have money, they have access to education, and what we begin to see is this class separation as the wealthy are able to afford to send their kids away for an education, but average Southerner is not able to do that. So public education is relatively slow to get started in the South. Again, it's because the rich are able to send their children to private schools. You can also see based on this chart, for the people who do own slaves in the South, it's a minority of the population. We can see here that the people who own no slaves make up roughly 75% of the Southern population. There are people, of course, then we've got about 25% who will own slaves, but we can see of the 25% of families in the South who do own slaves, the most commonly held number of slaves will be between 1 and 9. So the average person in the South, first, does not own slaves. And if you do just look at the people who do own slaves, they are not going to own a lot. So it's really this small percentage of people who own 20 or more slaves. That is your Southern aristocracy, the ones with the wealth, but also very much with the power. And if we take a look at the system of slavery itself, there were obviously so many problems with it. And the book refers to the system of slavery as becoming a slave to the slave system. And there are a lot of reasons why they feel that is the case. For one reason, the profits were so quick and fast that it encouraged people to kind of get while the getting was good. You make as much money as you can right now because who knows how long this is going to last. The problem was cotton ruins the land. So the land is going to become unusable, and that means cotton producers are always in need of new land. So they're going to be heading out west to try to expand their cotton growing area. There's always a need for worker, and there are always going to be jobs, but small farmers are soon realizing that they can't keep up with these larger farmers. And a lot of the small farmers will soon be forced to sell because of the lack of profit, because of the poor land quality. Another problem is that over-speculation in land and in slaves causes a lot of planters to go into debt. They want to get as much land and as many slaves as they can to hopefully make money, but sometimes go into debt in the process. So there's some financial instability that comes along with the slave system. Another problem with the system of slavery is going to be that King Cotton leads to a one-crop economy whose price level can be really at the mercy of world conditions. It's this lack of diversity that the South has when it comes to their economy, and they are so dependent on this one crop doing well and succeeding that they truly have a vested interest because they don't have much else that they can fall back on. Another problem with this system is that the South seems to in some ways resent the North because the North is profiting from cotton, and the South also feels that they're kind of dependent on the North for a lot of their manufactured goods. So as we come back and look at the system again, the white class structure in the South, the year before the Civil War begins, we see really what the hierarchy is. You know that at the very top of the social scale, you have your aristocracy, but then below that, you have small slave owners. However, below that, you also have your slaveless whites who tend to sneer at what they call the rich snobocracy. But even the people who don't own slaves are often going to defend slavery. And why? The answer is twofold. One is for economic reasons. Non-slave owners will defend slavery because, first, they hope to one day have enough social mobility upward that they are going to be able to afford slaves of their own. The second reason why they're often going to defend slavery is because even if you are someone who is poor and you cannot afford slaves of your own, you at least are a free person, which means you're not at the bottom of the social scale. And psychologically, that is important for people to not feel like they are at the bottom. So non-slave owners will want to keep slavery because it does give them a small feeling of superiority when deep down they probably realize they are in a pretty bad financial state themselves. So as we continue looking at the system of slavery, let's keep in mind that not all Black people in the United States are slaves. There are roughly 250,000 free Black people living in the South, many of whom own property, some of whom actually own slaves, but there certainly are restrictions on free Black people. There are restrictions regarding access to education. There are restrictions regarding access to civil and political rights. There are restrictions regarding certain jobs. So it is not necessarily a free versus slave society. There's also going to be that element of white free people versus Black free people as well. So as we focus on the majority of Black people who are going to be slaves, it will be about 90% of slaves who are living in plantations. The United States banned the importing of slaves in 1808, but It's still going to go on. People will still illegally import slaves because there's money to do that. Slaves were an investment. And so people are going to be careful in how they're going to treat slaves, because on one hand, the slave owner is going to want to get as much work as they can out of slaves, but on the other hand, you also can't afford to just beat a slave terribly, because then there's no work that's being done. So it is this strange kind of balance that some slave owners are going to try to find. But to come up with how slavery is for everyone, there isn't an answer, because it varied so much from person to person and plantation to plantation. So as we begin taking a look at the slave narratives, that's the idea, is that it is so difficult to just say this is how slavery was, because it isn't necessarily just that one way for all people. It does always mean, even if you happen to live on a plantation where there's a good relationship with the owner, it does still mean no civil rights, political rights. It means hard work. It means punishment for not following orders. It means an absolute feeling of uncertainty all the time and a lack of control over your own life. People are going to fight back against slavery in various ways. Some, like Toussaint Louverture, who you see here, will lead a slave rebellion in Haiti. But slave rebellions are really very rare, because the punishment every time for a slave rebellion is going to be death. Everybody who participates in a slave rebellion is going to be executed. That's just how they are dealt with. So instead, slaves will try to do other smaller acts of resistance, usually, to kind of fight back. Someone might try to injure the animals on a plantation, or sabotage the seeds or the tools. Do something that just means the work can't get done today. And that may be a way that people will attempt to get around slavery. And with that, we are going to end the first part of this lecture on Chapter 16. Make sure you listen to Part 2.